Japan had the engineering. America had the laws. And for decades, those two things were on a collision course that most car buyers never saw coming. Detroit knew it was losing. By 1982, Japanese automakers had grabbed nearly a quarter of the American car market, not by accident, not by luck, but because they were building machines that American engineers openly admitted were better, more reliable, more efficient, more honest. And Washington was watching. Hey, this is Mark, and you're welcome to AUTOSAYS. If that first sentence already raised a question in your mind, good, because this story goes a lot deeper than most people realize. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. Now, here is something that almost nobody talks about. The most exciting Japanese cars of the 1980s and 1990s were never sold in America. Not because they weren't good enough, but because they were too good. And the people with the power to keep them out used every tool available to make sure they stayed out. By the time American buyers finally got access to some of these cars through gray markets and private imports, the damage was already done, and a few of those cars became the most sought-after collectibles on Earth. But before I get to the cars themselves, I need to tell you about a meeting that happened in Washington in 1981, because without that meeting, this entire story plays out differently. In the spring of 1981, the Reagan administration sat down with Japanese trade officials and reached what they called a voluntary agreement. Japan would limit its car exports to the United States to 1.68 million vehicles per year. Voluntary is a generous word for it. The alternative was a full import tariff that would have devastated Japanese automakers overnight, so Japan agreed. And here is where it gets interesting, because that agreement didn't hurt Japan. It actually made Japanese cars more profitable. With supply capped, prices went up, and suddenly Toyota and Honda were collecting margins on American soil they had never seen before. But the real story wasn't in the cars being sold. It was in the cars being held back. Japanese automakers, now sitting on engineering talent they couldn't fully deploy in the US market, started building for themselves. They built for the Japanese domestic market, a market with no import quotas, no safety standards written by committees trying to slow them down, and a buyer base that demanded precision. The result was a generation of vehicles that, by every objective measure, outperformed anything Detroit was producing at the same price point. The Nissan Skyline GT-R, the Honda NSX, the Toyota Supra in its truest form, the Mazda RX-7, not the watered-down versions that eventually arrived on American shores, the real ones, the ones built for Japanese roads, with the full power and full engineering that American regulators and trade agreements made nearly impossible to bring over legally. Now, to understand why these cars were kept out, you have to understand the system that kept them out. And it wasn't just politics, it was money. By the mid-1980s, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were spending more on lobbying in Washington than on small car research and development. That is not an exaggeration. It is documented in congressional budget records. They were not trying to build a better car. They were trying to build a better wall. The safety standards and emissions requirements that applied to imported vehicles were written in ways that specifically disadvantaged foreign manufacturers. Not because American roads were uniquely dangerous, but because compliance was expensive, time-consuming, and could be used as a delay mechanism. A car that took 3 years to certify for the US market was a car that couldn't compete for 3 years. The Nissan Skyline GT-R is the clearest example of this. In Japan, from 1989 onward, the R32 Skyline was dominating every form of motorsport it entered. It won every single Japanese touring car championship race in its first year. Every one. The Australian Touring Car Championship banned it, not because it broke the rules, but because it won so consistently that other manufacturers threatened to pull out. A car so dominant that entire racing bodies had to rewrite their eligibility criteria just to slow it down. That car was not sold in America, not through any official channel, because the cost of bringing it into compliance with federal safety and emission standards made it financially impossible for Nissan to justify the US launch, and Nissan knew it. Detroit knew it. Washington knew it. But here is where the loop closes, and where a new question opens. American car buyers eventually found a way. The gray market. Private importers, many of them operating out of small garages in California and New Jersey, began bringing in Japanese domestic market cars through legal loopholes, registering them in states with looser inspection rules, and selling them to buyers who knew exactly what they were getting. By the early 1990s, this was a full industry. Tens of millions of dollars in vehicles moving through unofficial channels, and the government, rather than embracing it, started cracking down. Federal agencies began seizing gray market imports at ports. Registered cars were pulled off roads. Owners were told their vehicles didn't comply with federal standards. Which raises a bigger question. If these cars were so dangerous that they had to be seized, why are those same cars now legal to import once they turn 25 years old with zero modifications required? The 25-year rule is the U.S. government's own admission that the original restrictions were never really about safety. Under federal law, any vehicle over 25 years old can be imported into the United States without having to meet modern safety or emission standards, which means that a car considered too dangerous to drive in 1993 is legally streetable in 2018. The engineering didn't change, the roads didn't change. What changed was the commercial threat that car represented to American manufacturers. By the time a Skyline GT-R turns 25, it isn't competing with anything on a dealership floor. It's a collector item, and collector items don't take market share. The financial consequences of this era are still visible today. The cars that were banned, suppressed, or deliberately held out of the American market are now among the most valuable Japanese vehicles ever built. A clean R32 Skyline GT-R, which you could buy in Japan in 1989 for the equivalent of about $25,000, now sells at American auction for north of $60,000, sometimes considerably more depending on condition and provenance. A first-generation Honda NSX, which American buyers only got in a compromised form with a reduced power engine to meet U.S. regulations, sells for over $100,000 in unmodified Japanese spec. The market is correcting what the regulators got wrong, and it's doing it with interest. But here is what this story is really about, and this is where it gets personal. If you have ever stood on a car lot and felt like the options in front of you were somehow narrower than they should be, you were right. Not because manufacturers couldn't build something better, because the system around those manufacturers was designed to limit what reached you. The car you were allowed to buy was the result of trade negotiations, lobbying dollars, regulatory frameworks, and backroom agreements between governments and industries that had nothing to do with what you actually wanted. The best cars in the world were sitting in showrooms in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, and you were being handed a brochure for something else. The American auto market has always been shaped by power as much as by engineering. The Japanese domestic market cars of the late 1980s and early 1990s didn't lose because they weren't good enough. They were kept out because they were too good. And the people who lost the most from that weren't the car companies. It was you, the buyer, who never got to choose. Here is something worth sitting with. The 25-year rule has now unlocked the R32 Skyline, the FD RX-7, and the first-generation NSX for legal American ownership. By 2027, the R33 and early R34 Skylines begin to cross the threshold. These cars are coming, and the prices are already moving in anticipation. Buyers who understand what's coming are positioning now. Everyone else will be paying a premium in 5 years for cars they could have bought quietly today. The most powerful car lobby in the world spent decades keeping these machines off your roads. The market is finally overruling them. Whether you see that as justice, as irony, or just as a good investment opportunity, probably says something about how you relate to cars in the first place. So here is my question for you. If any of those banned Japanese cars had been sold freely in America when they were new, do you think Detroit would have been forced to build something better? Or would they have found another way to hold the line? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. And if this story left you wanting to understand the next chapter, stay close, because the cars that are quietly disappearing from Japanese auctions right now, the ones smart money is chasing before the 25-year window opens, that story is coming next, and it might change how you think about what's parked in your garage.